A mid-flight altercation spirals into chaos when Linda, an entitled and prejudiced woman, targets Darren, a calm and composed black passenger, simply for existing beside her. Her tirade escalates from racist remarks to outright physical aggression, sparking disbelief and outrage among fellow passengers. As the incident unfolds, passengers capture her behavior on video, exposing her blatant racism and dangerous actions. The confrontation becomes a viral sensation, leading to legal and social repercussions. This gripping story shines a spotlight on the insidious nature of prejudice, the importance of accountability, and the courage required to confront such injustice. Here is the story. What happens when a prejudiced woman tries to mask her bigotry and ends up being called out in a way she never expected? This story unravels during a flight that transforms into a powerful stand against discrimination. From simmering tensions at 30,000 feet to a dramatic turn that no one on board could have predicted, witness a tale of quiet resilience and sharp justice. This is the story of Darren Carter, a successful entrepreneur, and his unexpected encounter with ingrained prejudice. The faint hum of engines vibrated softly through the cabin as passengers filed into their seats. Darren Carter tucked his backpack under the seat in front of him and opened his travel book. Appreciating the calm before takeoff, his seat next to the window gave him a clear view of the sun setting over the tarmac. He liked moments like this, routine, peaceful, and productive. Midway down the aisle, Linda Reeves gripped the handle of her rolling suitcase, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the row numbers. Her movements were brisk, her lips pressed tight, exuding an air of impatience. As Linda reached her assigned row, she froze, staring at the man sitting by the window. Darren glanced up briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to his book. He felt her hesitation but didn't dwell on it. Linda's voice, however, sliced through the ambient chatter. "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake," she said, directing her words toward a passing flight attendant. The young woman paused, her professional smile unwavering. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Linda gestured stiffly toward Darren without meeting his gaze. "I need another seat. This isn't going to work for me." The attendant checked her seating chart and replied gently, "I'm sorry, ma'am. The flight is fully booked. You're in your assigned seat." Linda's expression tightened, and she muttered under her breath as she reluctantly wedged herself into the middle seat beside Darren. She adjusted her tray table with exaggerated movements, sighing loudly as though to make a point. Darren kept his focus on his book, though he could feel her irritation radiating toward him. The plane door sealed shut, and the flight attendant's voice announced the final preparations for takeoff. As the plane ascended into the sky, Darren hoped the tension would fade. It didn't. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turned off, Linda began shifting in her seat, her movements calculated to make her discomfort known. Her elbow nudged Darren repeatedly as she adjusted her belongings, her sighs becoming increasingly dramatic. "You'd think people would have the decency to accommodate others," she muttered loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. Darren turned his head toward her, his expression neutral but questioning. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" he asked calmly. Linda's eyes widened, caught off guard by his directness. "I'm just saying," she replied with a condescending tone. "Some people don't consider how their presence affects others." Darren's calm demeanor didn't waver. "If you're uncomfortable, that's a reflection of your feelings, not my actions." Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Unbelievable," she hissed. "People like you always think it's about them." Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of passengers around them. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows, clearly catching the unspoken hostility in Linda's tone. Darren stayed composed, refusing to rise to her bait. The flight attendant approached again, her face tight with concern. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" she asked, her gaze darting between Linda and Darren. Linda pointed at Darren, her voice rising. "Yes, I don't feel safe sitting here. He's invading my space and making me uncomfortable." The attendant's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at Darren, who had yet to move from his position. "Ma'am, this passenger hasn't done anything wrong. I'll need you to remain calm and refrain from making further remarks." Linda's face flushed, her frustration boiling over. "So I'm just supposed to sit here and feel unsafe? Is that what you're saying?" Another passenger leaned forward and interjected, "Lady, he's just sitting there. You're the one causing a scene." Linda whipped her head around, glaring at the man. "Mind your own business," she snapped. Darren turned to the flight attendant. "If I may," he said calmly, "I'd like to ask, exactly what am I doing that's making you feel unsafe?" Linda hesitated, her words faltering. It's just, people like you don't understand how uncomfortable this is for me," she blurted out. "People like me?" Darren asked, his voice sharper now. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The cabin fell silent, the hum of the plane's engines the only sound as passengers exchanged knowing glances. Linda's cheeks reddened as she realized how exposed she had become. "You know exactly what I mean," she snapped defensively. "This isn't about race, so don't twist my words." Darren leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "I didn't bring up race," he replied. "But now that you have, let me ask again. What about me makes you uncomfortable?" Linda turned away, muttering under her breath, but the damage was done. The atmosphere in row 17 was charged with tension, and Darren knew this was far from over. The murmurs among passengers grew louder. A young man a few rows back raised his phone, discreetly recording the interaction. A woman seated nearby spoke up, her tone firm. "You're embarrassing yourself, ma'am. Just let it go." Linda's hands gripped the armrests tightly, her face flushing with anger. "I shouldn't have to sit here and feel like this," she exclaimed, her voice rising again. "This is harassment." "Harassment?" Darren repeated, his voice calm but laced with incredulity. "Ma'am, I've been reading a book. If you feel threatened by that, perhaps you need to examine your own biases." The young man holding his phone chimed in, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Keep talking, ma'am. This will make for an interesting video when it goes viral." Linda turned to him, her voice trembling with rage. "You can't record me without my permission." "It's perfectly legal," the man replied, unfazed. "And frankly, the world deserves to see this." The flight attendant returned, her expression stern. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Sit down and remain quiet, or we will involve law enforcement upon landing." Linda's shoulders sagged, her defiance giving way to a simmering silence. Darren returned his attention to the window, letting the moment settle. For now, the confrontation seemed over, but Darren knew the story was far from finished. "You just existing is provocation," Linda shrieked, her voice cutting through the cabin like a siren. "This is what people like you do, stir up chaos and pretend to be innocent." The flight attendant, who had been quietly monitoring the escalating situation, finally intervened with a firm voice. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Lower your voice and sit down immediately, or we will be forced to escalate this matter further." Linda's face flushed crimson, her anger boiling over as she pointed a trembling finger at Darren. "I'm not the one causing the problem, he is," she spat, her tone dripping with indignation. Nearby passengers exchanged incredulous looks, their collective frustration beginning to bubble over. A middle-aged woman sitting a row ahead muttered under her breath, "Just sit down already, for goodness sake." Linda, however, refused to relent. Squaring her shoulders, she stood defiantly, her posture like that of a soldier bracing for battle. "I have every right to defend myself against this kind of intimidation," she declared, her voice rising with each word. Her finger jabbed in Darren's direction as though it was a weapon. Darren remained composed, seated with his hands folded neatly in his lap. "You're fabricating this entire situation," he said calmly but firmly. "The only thing I've done is sit here. You've been antagonistic since the moment you arrived." Her face contorted with indignation, Linda snapped, "Don't you dare twist this on me." Her voice carried through the cabin, drawing more attention as passengers leaned into the aisle, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A younger woman in the row behind Darren couldn't stay silent any longer. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, she stood up, her face a mixture of disgust and exasperation. "Lady, we've all been sitting here watching you lose your mind over absolutely nothing. Nobody's buying your act. Just sit down." Linda spun around to face her, venom dripping from her voice. "Oh, of course, you'd side with him. People like you always jump to conclusions without knowing the full story." The younger woman's jaw dropped in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You're doubling down on this nonsense?" Linda ignored her and whirled back toward the flight attendant, her gestures frantic. "I demand to speak to someone in charge. This is outrageous. He's dangerous, and no one is listening to me." The murmurs around the cabin grew louder, irritation spreading like wildfire. A man across the aisle leaned into view, his tone sharp and exasperated. "The only dangerous thing here is your attitude, lady. Sit down before you get thrown off this plane." Linda turned to him, her face a vivid shade of red. "How dare you? You have no idea what I've been through." The flight attendant stepped closer, her patience clearly hanging by a thread. "Ma'am, this is my final warning. Sit down now, or we'll be forced to call security upon landing." Linda scoffed, her indignation bubbling over. "Call security. I'd love to see them explain why they let someone like him make me feel unsafe." Darren exhaled, shaking his head slowly. "You're digging yourself deeper with every word," he said quietly, his composure as steady as a rock. "Oh, don't you pretend to be innocent," Linda snapped back. "You've been antagonizing me with your smugness this whole time." A middle-aged man seated a few rows ahead couldn't hold back any longer. He stood turning to address the cabin with a loud, clear voice. Look, this guy has done nothing but sit quietly and read a book. She's the one causing all the trouble. We've all seen it. A wave of murmured agreement rippled through the cabin. Linda's eyes darted around, her confidence flickering as the reality of her isolation began to sink in. But instead of backing down, she clenched her fists and took a step closer to Darren, her voice rising to a fever pitch. You think you're so clever? She spat, her words trembling with fury. People like you always think you can push boundaries and get away with it. Darren raised his palm slightly, a gesture of calm. I'm not pushing anything, he said evenly. You're the one making a scene. Linda stepped even closer, her gestures wild and erratic. Oh, you'd love to paint me as the villain, wouldn't you? That's what people like you do. Always flipping the script, always playing the victim. Gasps filled the cabin as her blatant prejudice hit a breaking point. The young man who had been filming earlier raised his phone again, pointing it directly at her. Congratulations, ma'am. You're officially going viral, he said loudly. Keep going. The internet's going to love this. Linda's face twisted with fury and she lunged toward him, her arm outstretched. Turn that off. You have no right to film me, she shouted. The young man leaned back, holding the phone just out of reach. I have every right to film this public meltdown, he replied coolly. You're making my day. The flight attendant stepped between them, her voice now authoritative and commanding. Ma'am, sit down now. This is your final warning. Linda froze for a moment, her chest heaving as her eyes darted around the cabin. The passengers' faces mirrored a mix of disdain, frustration, and disbelief. She muttered under her breath, You're all against me. This is exactly what's wrong with the world. Nobody listens to the truth anymore. The flight attendant pointed firmly to Linda's seat. Ma'am, sit down now. But Linda didn't move. Her defiance was clear, her body stiff with anger. Darren let out a long, controlled exhale, his gaze steady as he looked at her. He didn't want this confrontation, but he wasn't going to shy away from it either. Then, without warning, Linda lunged toward Darren, her hand clawing at his shirt as she screamed, You don't deserve to be here. Passengers erupted into chaos. Hey, stop her, someone shouted as Linda grabbed at Darren's arm, trying to pull him forward. Darren leaned back, raising his arms defensively. Get off me, he said, his voice firm but steady. The flight attendant and 2 male passengers rushed to intervene. The young man who had been filming grabbed Linda's arm, pulling her back. That's enough, he yelled. You're out of control. Another passenger, a burly man across the aisle, stepped in and restrained her other arm. Linda struggled wildly, screaming incoherently. Let me go. This is assault. I'm the victim here. The flight attendant, her voice trembling but resolute, addressed the cabin crew. We need restraints immediately. A second crew member returned quickly with zip ties, and together they secured Linda's wrists. She continued to thrash, shouting at anyone who dared to look her way. This is illegal. You're all going to regret this, every single one of you. The passengers who had helped restrain her guided her back into her seat. Bound and fuming, Linda glared at Darren, her voice low but venomous. You think you've won? You'll pay for this. You people always do. Darren shook his head, his voice calm but firm. The only person paying for anything here is you. The flight attendant leaned down toward Darren, her face etched with regret. Sir, I'm so sorry for everything you've endured. Law enforcement will handle her when we land. Darren nodded, his voice quiet. Thank you. Linda slumped into her seat, muttering angrily under her breath. Passengers around her exchanged glances, their disgust palpable. One woman muttered loudly enough for all to hear. Good riddance. Darren turned back toward the window, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds. The cabin, though quieter now, still buzzed with residual tension. Darren knew the confrontation was over, but the emotional toll lingered. For now, he took solace in the fact that the passengers around him had stood together against Linda's hate. But as the plane began its descent, he braced himself for the fallout to come. I'll sue every last one of you, Linda screamed, her voice slicing through the quiet as passengers winced and exchanged exasperated looks. A man near the back of the plane muttered, Does she ever stop? While another shook his head, visibly annoyed. Darren sat quietly in his seat, the earlier adrenaline finally wearing off. He exhaled deeply, trying to center himself as the flight attendant reassured him softly, Security will handle this as soon as we land. He offered her a small nod, though the tension in his shoulders remained. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Yet the usual unfastening of seatbelts and bustling activity was replaced with a heavy silence. No one dared to move until the storm brewing in the back of the plane was dealt with. The cabin doors opened, and 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. Their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Passengers turned in their seats, craning their necks to watch the officers make their way toward the back. Linda's shrill protests began even before they reached her. "What is this?" she shrieked, yanking against the zip ties that secured her wrists. Her movements were frantic, her face a picture of disbelief and rage. "Why are they here? I didn't do anything wrong. This is harassment." The lead officer approached her with a calm yet firm demeanor. "Ma'am, you've been reported for causing a disturbance and physically assaulting another passenger. We need you to cooperate." Linda's face twisted with outrage, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "You've got to be kidding me. I'm the victim here. That man—" She gestured wildly toward Darren, her neck craning. "He provoked me. He's the one you should be arresting." Darren remained seated, his expression stoic, refusing to engage. The flight attendant stepped forward, addressing the officers in a steady tone. "She's been disruptive since before takeoff. She physically attacked a passenger, and we had to restrain her for the safety of everyone on board." The officer didn't flinch. "Ma'am, you need to stand up and come with us. If you resist, additional charges will be filed." Linda's defiance flared. "I'm not going anywhere. This is a setup. It's discrimination." Her voice cracked as she thrashed against her restraints, her movements jerky and wild. The murmurs from the passengers grew louder, their frustration bubbling to the surface. "Just get her off the plane already," a woman muttered audibly. Another passenger rolled his eyes, his face etched with disbelief. Linda's protest escalated into frantic shrieks as the officers carefully unfastened her seatbelt and guided her to stand. She stomped her feet and twisted against their grip. "Get your hands off me. This is illegal. I'll ruin every one of you." The officers kept their composure, their grips firm but controlled. "Ma'am, calm down," one of them said, his voice steady. "We're not here to hurt you, but you need to cooperate." Linda's shrieks only grew louder, echoing through the narrow cabin. "Cooperate with what? This circus? You're ruining my life for no reason." Passengers leaned away as she was led down the aisle, some recording the scene on their phones, others muttering under their breath. One man smirked and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Enjoy your day in court, lady." As Linda passed Darren's row, she twisted her head to glare at him, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You'll regret this. People like you always ruin everything." Darren met her glare with calm, unflinching resolve. He didn't respond, letting her words hang in the air like an unanswered echo. The officers quickly ushered her off the plane, her shouts growing fainter as the cabin doors closed behind her. The tension in the plane evaporated like a released breath. A man across the aisle leaned toward Darren, his voice low but sincere. Good riddance, that woman was completely out of her mind. The flight attendant returned to Darren's seat, her tone apologetic. "Sir, we're deeply sorry for everything you've endured. Security has her in custody, and the airline will follow up." Darren nodded, his voice calm but weary. "Thank you." Passengers began to gather their belongings, their earlier frustration softening into words of support for Darren. A woman seated nearby offered him a warm smile. "You handled that better than I ever could have. She made a complete fool of herself." Darren gave her a small nod of gratitude, though the weight of the encounter was still heavy on his chest. At the gate, Darren waited near a security counter, his carry-on bag resting at his feet. He had been asked to stay behind for a brief debriefing with airport authorities. Across the terminal, Linda stood flanked by 2 officers, her voice rising above the hum of the terminal as passengers from the flight looked on, some recording the scene with their phones. "This is an outrage," she bellowed. "I'm the victim here. That man should be the one standing here, not me." Her accusations carried little weight now, as the crowd looked on with thinly veiled amusement or outright disdain. One of the officers addressed her firmly. "Ma'am, multiple witnesses and the flight crew have provided consistent accounts of your behavior. You'll need to remain here for further questioning." Linda's face burned with indignation. "Questioning you should be questioning him. This is a conspiracy. He provoked me." Meanwhile, Darren sat silently, watching the scene unfold from a distance. A flight attendant approached him, her tone kind but professional. "Mr. Calloway, thank you for your cooperation. Security will take it from here, if you'd like. We can arrange transportation for you to leave the airport." Darren gave a tired smile. "That'd be great. I just want this to be over." A young woman from the flight approached him as the attendant walked away. "I just wanted to say you were incredible back there," she said softly. That woman was so far out of line, and you handled it better than anyone else could have. Darren gave a slight shrug. I just stayed calm and let her show everyone who she really was. The woman nodded. I'm glad so many people recorded it. She can't deny what she did. Across the terminal, Linda continued to rail against the officers and the situation. You'll all regret this, she shouted. I'll sue the airline, the crew, the passengers, every single one of you. I've never been treated like this in my life. As she was escorted toward a secure area, her voice echoed behind her. This isn't over, you'll all pay for this. A passenger walking past muttered, No, I think you're the one paying here. Darren allowed himself a faint smile as he stood to leave. Though the ordeal had been exhausting, watching Linda be held accountable provided a small sense of vindication. As he walked toward the exit, the weight of the confrontation still lingered, but his steps were steady. He knew this was only the beginning of the larger reckoning she would face. I am not a criminal. I was just protecting myself. Linda's voice echoed through the sterile walls of the holding cell, her protest growing more frantic with each passing moment. The officer escorting her back to the cell remained silent, his professional demeanor unwavering. This is all a mistake, she muttered, her heels clicking against the cold tiles with each step. I'll sue every single one of you for this injustice. The officer didn't respond, leaving Linda alone with the suffocating silence of the empty cell. As she sank onto the cold metal bench, Linda's confidence began to unravel. The weight of the situation pressed on her, inescapable and crushing. For the first time, a flicker of doubt pierced through her indignation. Hours passed, her resolve faltering with each tick of the clock. Meanwhile, across town, Darren sat in his lawyer's office, the memory of the flight still vivid in his mind. His posture was calm but resolute as his lawyer meticulously reviewed the evidence, a collection of video clips and passenger statements that painted a damning picture of Linda's behavior. This case isn't just about what happened to you, his lawyer said, her voice measured but firm. It's about sending a clear message people like her need to understand that there are consequences for their actions. Darren nodded slowly, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. I didn't want any of this, he admitted, his tone somber. But I can't let her walk away without being held accountable. The lawyer leaned back, her gaze steady. The criminal charges will take priority, but once that's resolved, we'll move forward with the civil suit. This isn't just about punishment, it's about setting a precedent. For the first time since the incident, Darren felt a glimmer of hope. Justice, though slow, was within reach. Linda's arraignment drew a modest crowd to the courthouse, a mix of curious onlookers, reporters, and even some passengers from the flight. Over the past week, her name and face had become infamous, plastered across headlines and social media feeds. As she was led into the courtroom, her complexion was pale, her expression a volatile blend of anger and fear. The prosecutor, a composed woman with an air of authority, wasted no time laying out the charges: assault, disorderly conduct, and interference with a flight crew. Linda sat stiffly beside her lawyer, a man who looked as though he was accustomed to dealing with volatile clients. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Miss Thompson, do you understand the charges against you? The judge asked, his tone firm. Linda abruptly stood, ignoring her lawyer's attempt to restrain her. Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding, she blurted, her voice trembling with frustration. That man provoked me. I was defending myself. The prosecutor raised an unimpressed eyebrow. Your Honor, the defendant's claims are not supported by the evidence. We have multiple corroborating witness accounts and video footage showing her escalating the situation and initiating violence. Linda's face turned red as she turned to the prosecutor. You weren't there. You don't know what it was like. He made me feel unsafe. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, punctuated by audible gasps. The judge rapped his gavel sharply. Ms. Thompson, you will remain silent unless addressed directly. Linda slumped back into her chair, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the table. Her lawyer, visibly flustered, leaned in to whisper something to her, but she waved him off impatiently. The prosecutor continued, her tone calm but cutting. Given the severity of the charges and the defendant's lack of accountability, we recommend she remain in custody or post substantial bail. Linda's lawyer argued for leniency, citing her lack of prior criminal history, but the judge remained unmoved. Bail is set at $225,000, he declared, his gavel striking with finality. The next hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks. The defendant will remain in custody unless bail is posted. Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. This is outrageous, she shouted as officers approached. I'm not a criminal. You're all against me. Her protest continued as she was escorted out, the cameras outside the courtroom capturing every word of her dramatic exit. Darren, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, rose to leave. He hadn't come for a sense of vindication, but to ensure that the wheels of justice were turning fairly. As Linda's shouts faded into the distance, he felt a small measure of closure. Outside the courthouse, a journalist approached Darren, microphone in hand. "Mr. James, do you have any comment on today's proceedings?" Darren paused, his expression calm. "No comment," he said simply, walking away without another word. As he descended the courthouse steps, the chatter of the crowd buzzed behind him, but he tuned it out. The day's events were a step toward accountability, but Darren knew this wasn't the end. The viral video of Linda's meltdown continued to dominate social media, with hashtags like Narplane Karen and a flight fiasco trending for days. Late-night comedians skewered her actions, while memes flooded every platform. Linda's attempts to control the narrative only backfired. A post she shared, claiming she was the real victim of cancel culture, was met with a barrage of criticism. "Victim lady, you attacked a man reading a book," one comment read. Meanwhile, Darren remained quiet, heeding his lawyer's advice to avoid media engagement. He focused on preparing for the next steps, including a civil lawsuit. Support poured in from strangers and organizations alike, bolstering his resolve. On the day of Linda's trial, the courtroom was packed. The prosecutor meticulously laid out the evidence, from passenger testimonies to video clips showing Linda's tirade and physical aggression. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the videos played, her words and actions laid bare for all to see. Linda's lawyer attempted to frame her behavior as a lapse in judgment, citing the public humiliation she had already endured. But the judge remained stern. "Ms. Thompson," he said, "your actions endangered the safety of everyone on that flight. This court finds you guilty on all charges." He sentenced her to 90 days in jail, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. She was also ordered to pay restitution to Darren for the emotional and physical harm caused. Linda's face crumbled as the officers approached. "This isn't fair," she wailed. "I've lost everything. My job, my reputation. I don't deserve this." The judge's gavel came down sharply. "This court has ruled your behavior has consequences." As Linda was escorted out, her protests fading into the distance, Darren sat in quiet reflection. His lawyer leaned over, her voice soft. "Justice was served today." Darren nodded slowly. "It's a step forward," he said. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones extended. Darren paused briefly, his voice calm but resolute. "Let the verdict speak for itself," he said before walking away. As he descended the courthouse steps, Darren allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He had stood firm in the face of hate, and for now, that was enough.